Bonnett is an intellectual historian and Tier 2 Canada Research Chair in the Digital Humanities at Brock University. And he demonstrates a fresh take on Harold Innis's work by looking at Harold Innis's work to understand the impact of self-organizing emergent change on economies and societies. Bonnett has published in journals as diverse as War in History, to History in Computing, and Literary and Linguistic Computing. He's currently working on a lab devoted to the emerging medium of augmented reality at Brock University. So I welcome Dr. Bonnett.
Thanks, Jeff.
Well, thank you very much. Can you hear me okay? Well, first of all, I should say, as a humanist, I would like to stand in solidarity with Patricia. I, too, will be reading my paper. In fact, I'm going to be even more old school. I'm reading mine from paper. So, organizers, take note. You have to realize we humanists, we are creatures of habit. We've been doing this for about 500 years. So there was talk about radical formulations earlier today. And, well, this whole idea of speaking extemporaneous strikes us really as rather odd. We'll come around. 200 years from now, we'll give it brief consideration. 300 years from now, we'll give it extended consideration. 400 years from now, we'll form a panel. So, in any case, I'm very glad to be here. Really enjoying the talk so far today. Very much enjoyed what Patricia had to say about some of the fields of mathematics. I enjoyed what Peter had to say about the need to study economic history was music to my ears, as you will see shortly. My take on I'm not here to give you a report on the contemporary field of complexity economics. What I am here to do, as Jeff indicated, is to give you some sense about the history of economic thought in this country, particularly as it was expressed by Harold Adams Innis. And before I start, I'd be remiss if I didn't introduce Innis's daughter, Ann Innis Dagg, who is here with us today with her partner, Alan Cairns. Thank you very much for coming to see us. It's always a delight. Anyhow, shall we get started then? Now, those of you who don't know him, Innis is a name that tends to pop up in places like the CBC and the Literary Review of Canada, but there aren't very many Canadians who know about him or why he matters. The story that I have to tell you started in 1894, some 90 kilometers to the south of here, in Waterloo, Ontario, where Harold Innis was born. There are a lot of descriptors that we can give to the family of William and Mary Innis. They were farmers. They were Baptists. They were the descendants of Scottish loyalists who maintained a soft spot for the country that gave rise to their surname. They believed in hard work. There was no choice. And they instilled the same ethic in son Harold because of their ambitions for him. Innis's mother, Mary, in particular, wanted Harold to enter the ministry. That ambition was never realized because the 20th century got in the way. In 1913, Innis enrolled at McMaster University, then in Toronto, and learned the first great lesson of his scholarly career. Civilizations are subject to critical inquiry. While there, Innis was exposed to the teaching of the idealist philosopher James Den Broeke, who posed a simple question that stayed with Innis for the rest of his life. Why do we attend to the things to which we attend? That question would eventually lead Innis to make several important contributions to the field of Western and global history, works that also became founding documents for the field of communications. Innis graduated from McMaster in 1916 in order to join the Canadian Army. By the fall, he found himself in France, and in April 1917, a full participant of the First World War as an artillery spotter during the Battle of Vimy Ridge. The war would prove to be the second great formative experience of Innis's life. While university had taught him that civilizations were subject to inquiry, the First World War taught him that they were also subject to catastrophe. In the 32 years Innis worked as a professional scholar, he would consistently point to the First and Second World Wars as symptoms of a West that was in decline. In July of 1917, Innis was wounded in the leg by shrapnel, a wound severe enough that he was released from further active service. While convalescing in Britain, Innis was able to begin research on his master's degree, which he completed upon his research to Canada, or upon his return to Canada in April 1918. The following fall, he enrolled in the University of Chicago's PhD program in economics. Chicago was Innis's third great formative influence. While there, he was exposed to the writings of Thorstein Veblen and came to realize that not only were cultures subject to critical inquiry and subject to collapse, they were also subject to a particular form of change. Innis was so impressed by Veblen's writings that he would employ them in the 1920s to argue for the reconstitution of economic theory. Economists could no longer rely on the mechanical constructs of change embedded in classical economics. Economic systems were not static entities. They emerged, they evolved, they transformed themselves. As arenas of change, they were more akin to biological than physical systems, displaying patterns of change found in embryology and ecology. Now, it is this feature of Innis's thought that drew my attention to him back in the 1990s, and it is this feature, I think, that suggests he warrants renewed scrutiny in the present. In contemporary parlance, Innis presented a philosophy of history based on the idea of self-organization. This core idea was the template underlying his writings on economic history. It also shaped the view of technological and cognitive change he presented in his writings on communications. Now, before I burden you any further with any more polysyllabic verbiage, what do I mean by the terms emergent change and self-organization, which I take to be synonymous terms? Put simply, self-organization rests on the idea that there are certain classes of systems studied in physics, chemistry, biology, and the human and social sciences that are not fixed, immutable, closed things. Instead, they are semi-stable structures that seem to come out of nowhere. They form, crash, reform, and in so doing, adapt to their surroundings. What is interesting about these systems is that they share common properties. A physical system comprised of condensed matter can share properties with a biological system comprised of ants. Because of their ubiquity and because of their commonality, researchers since the 1980s in disciplines ranging from anthropology and economics to biology and computer science have started collaborating to gain a deeper understanding of these systems. Their domain of study is known as the science of complexity. Their object of study is referred to as the complex adaptive system. Now, one of the interesting features of complex adaptive systems is that they are historically contingent. As spatio-temporal objects, they are in many cases better described by historical narratives than mathematical notations. And if you opt to embrace your inner humanist and go with the narrative, you will find that almost all start with a reference to agents on the ground. The agents you will find depend on the system you are studying. If it's a city or economy, your agents will be humans. If it's an ecosystem, the agents will be multiple species of plants and animals. If it's a chemical chain reaction, the agents will be distinct chemical compounds. Our story then moves forward when our agents begin to interact with each other. In one context, individuals on the ground will begin to trade. In another, one molecule will enter into a catalytic relationship with a second. Our plot continues when we begin to notice something very strange. The activities of the participating agents become coordinated and interconnected. Their interaction, their communication, has prompted the appearance, the self-organization, of an overarching structure that defines and constrains the behavior of its participating agents through the governance of formal cause. In the case of our humans, that overarching structure is an economy. In the case of our chemical molecules, that structure is an autocatalytic set. At this stage, we should realize that we have not reached the end of our story. If anything, we have only reached the end of the first chapter. In our narrative, we have a structure. It coheres with the temporal trajectory of complex systems, which is punctuated with attractors or points of equilibrium. In our tale, we also have a telos, a role for Aristotle's final cause. It mandates a direction for history, one that shows complex systems attaining heightened degrees of complexity, hierarchy, and capacity over time. And finally, in our chronicle, we have an impetus, a dynamic that pushes self-organizing systems from one equilibrium point to the next. That dynamic is known generally as positive feedback and in economics as increasing returns. I expect most of you will know this concept as a matter of course, but for the sake of completeness, here I'll simply note that it refers to the cycles of growth in markets that are self-reinforcing and self-sustaining. Firms on the right side of an increasing returns market enjoy high profits, diminishing costs, and subsequent opportunities for further growth. Firms on the wrong side of the same market, by contrast, do not. In fact, they often go extinct, while their successful counterparts go on to form monopolies and oligopolies that dominate the market. Now, when discussing Innis, it's important to recognize that he did not function like a mathematician. He did not view these ideas at a remove. They were not the stuff of thought experiments that he thought might be useful to someone someday. Instead, he saw them as the grounds of history. If you wanted to know why empires rose and fell, his discussion would take you there. If you wanted to know how an Otterville farm boy could find himself on the fields of Vimy, his discussion again would invariably take you there. Consider, for example, the narrative that appears in the cod fisheries. It was the last monograph in economic history that Innis ever wrote, and one of the first ever to treat the North Atlantic as a unified economic and cultural system. Innis's purpose in this work was threefold: to document the shifts of the North Atlantic economy from a mercantile to a more or less unregulated economy, to document the contest by Europe's great powers to establish an economic and then an imperial presence in North America, and to determine why Britain won and why, in the end, its victory proved so fleeting. The answer was simple. Britain, for a time, adapted to the demands of an increasing returns economy. Its primary competitor, France, did not. Through default and later design, Britain permitted multiple agents, its fishing fleet, to engage in trade and to support migration to its colonies. The French fishing fleet, for reasons of its own, chose not to engage in commerce. The French regime, to protect the fur trade, chose not to support mass migration to New France. Britain's decision resulted in the establishment of multiple colonies, economic diversification, increasing returns, and by the 18th century, the emergence of an integrated trading network within the First British Empire. France's colonies enjoyed nowhere near the same rate of growth or economic diversification. Its Caribbean colonies rarely traded with New France or France and were forced to engage in trade with Britain's colonies to obtain needed supplies. In Innis's reading, the incorporation of Guadeloupe and its sister sugar colonies proved instrumental in provoking the collapse of the French Empire and then the First British Empire. Britain was able to leverage products generated by the sugar trade and increasing returns to heighten its effectiveness in the fur trade. It expanded its markets and lowered its costs while diminishing New France's share and heightening its costs. In essence, Britain bankrupted New France. The conquest of 1763 formalized politically what the fur trade had established economically: Britain's dominance over North America. It was a short victory. In Innis's accounts, a small centralized group of sugar plantation owners hijacked Britain's economic policy, undercut its movement towards economic liberty, and set the seeds for the American Revolution. Almost immediately after the Treaty of Paris, sugar producers lobbied the British Parliament to ban American trade with France's sugar colonies. Parliament obliged with the Sugar Act of 1764, an act that precipitated a conflict that defied resolution. Over the next decade, the American colonies, protesting that Britain's sugar colonies could not meet a fraction of their demand, continued smuggling. Parliament responded with legislation designed to further regulate American activity. The British pushed, the Americans pushed back. The result was Lexington and Concord, the second major civil war of the English-speaking world, and the collapse of the First British Empire. In Innis's reading, the French Empire in North America fell because it failed to harness the power of increasing returns to ensure its survival. The First British Empire fell because it failed to realize that it could not contain the increasing returns economy that it had spawned. Both faced opportunities and limits, both failed to attend to them, and both collapsed. Innis drew two implications from his research devoted to Canadian and North Atlantic economic history. The first was that national and international economies were too complex and too indeterminate to manipulate by government policy. He was not a fan of Keynesian economics. The second was that state, corporate, and individual actors needed to work within the constraints imposed by the economic systems in which they operated. Much of the time, he believed state actors employing Keynesian prescriptions operated in the dark without a deep understanding of the economies they were seeking to ameliorate. For Innis, such actions in principle were as dangerous as those taken by British plantation owners and the British Parliament in the 18th century. Acting in ignorance, they initiated policies that culminated in the American Revolution. To evade that danger, Innis pressed his colleagues to map the social, economic, and cultural systems that concerned them, and further to represent them as spatial-temporal objects. In his estimation, neither text nor linear mathematical equations, the standard expressive instruments of the social sciences and humanities, had the purchase to meet those requirements. To find ones that did, scholars would either have to invent new ones or appropriate extant ones from domains of human practice that until now had had little or no relationship with the field of economics. Innis, ever the interdisciplinarian, opted for the latter. On the economic significance of cultural factors, an article that marked one of his first forays into the field of communications, he noted, alas, inelegantly, that economic history may provide grappling irons with which to lay hold of areas on the fringe of economics, whether in religion or in art, and with which in turn to enrich other subjects, as well as to rescue economics from the present-mindedness which pulverizes other subjects and makes a broad approach almost impossible. In the essay, Political Economy in the Modern State, Innis argued that the importance of economic history was, quote, its emphasis on training in a search for patterns rather than mathematical formulae. It should compel the study of interrelationships between the social sciences and between nations, unquote. Now, what did Innis mean by these statements? When you read these articles in conjunction with Innis's other writings on communications, it becomes clear that Innis was pressing for formalisms that would support two tasks: information visualization and information collocation. The basis of Innis's interest in art becomes clear upon reading his unpublished History of Communications. There he notes that Italian artists in the 15th and 16th centuries routinely used multiple modes of representation due to, he writes, the general inability to conceive abstract ideas. Information visualization was used with other forms of representation to make difficult ideas comprehensible to a general populace. The emblem book, he notes, was devised by Andreas Alciati early in the 16th century. Poetry, one of the oldest arts, was combined with engraving, one of the newest. Quoting Francis Bacon's defense of emblematic literature, Innis noted, emblems reduce intellectual conceptions to visual images, and that which is sensible strikes the memory and is more easily imprinted on it than that which is intellectual. In the domain of religion, Innis refers in The Bias of Communication to the French historian Émile Malle's observation that tout ce que les théologiens, les encyclopédistes, les interprètes de la Bible ont dit d'essentiel a été exprimé par les peintures souveraines ou par la sculpture. Innis's interest in information collocation can be found in tracts in the anthology titled Political Economy in the Modern State, tracts that press scholars to combine analytical frameworks, formalisms, and data from multiple disciplines. More specifically, it can be found in 1941 correspondence with his colleague Arthur Cole, where he discusses the value of combining one formalism, the time series, with another, the map, a procedure Roger Tomlinson and his colleagues in the Canadian government would formalize some 20 years later to produce the world's first geographic information system. In an October letter, Innis indicated that his methods of georeferencing economic data had already deepened his understanding of Canadian economic history. Such a geographic approach had afforded illumination of the history of areas in which a given industry remains dominant over a long period of time, i.e. fur and fish. In his studies of stables and transport systems, Innis had discovered that Canada's economy functioned much like a weather system, insofar as sectors specializing in wheat or other commodities were akin to weather fronts that started in the east and moved west. The factor precipitating movement and change, he suggested, was, quote, to a very large extent, the transportation cost. As technological improvements in transportation emerged, the production of geographic areas changed. For example, the wheat belt moved steadily west and its place was taken by dairying or other forms of agriculture, unquote. Innis, unfortunately, was never able to complete the studies he proposed to Cole in the early 1940s, in part because he devoted the majority of his time to the field of communications, and in part because he left us too soon. In November 1952, Innis died of prostate cancer and scholars in the intervening years have dedicated themselves to reaching a deeper understanding of his life and thought. No one can know for sure what Harold Innis would have said to a gathering like this, but I rather suspect he would have pointed to the fact that we live in a period when much of the received wisdom of the Academy is under scrutiny, and he would have been delighted to see that the critical spirit of the age was infiltrating his discipline. I'll also venture to suggest that he would now, as he did then, press scholars establishing and emerging to attain a deeper understanding of the emergent, self-organizing nature of economic systems. He also likely would have argued that one way that understanding can be purchased is through a renewed emphasis on economic history. If he lived in the present, I expect he would have had a very hard time keeping Innis away from a GIS lab. It was just the sort of application that he sought to support his research. I also suspect that he would have continued the research he described to Arthur Cole and would urge us to do the same. Innis's vision of economic history was continent-wide and North Atlantic-wide. He would have sought to map the multiple sectors of economic activity in North America over time and to study their evolution in relation to transport and other disruptive technologies. I make no claim to a deep knowledge of economic historiography, but I am aware of no study that has been pursued along the lines Innis described. He would urge us to start. He would also, I suggest, urge new economists to continue the agenda of information visualization and information co-location he articulated in the 1940s. Given his interest in the contingent, emergent nature of economic systems, I think Innis would have urged his colleagues to consider doing two things. First, he would have urged scholars to appropriate formalisms dedicated not only to pattern detection, but also to pattern replication. He would have been fascinated by the potential of agent-based simulations to replicate social, economic, and cultural patterns embedded in real-world data. And he would have followed the works of scholars such as Tespatian rather closely. Second, he would have urged scholars to consider not only the convergence, the co-location of multiple forms of representation. Given sufficient exposure to recent developments in computation, I think he would have pressed for the convergence of multiple algorithms and computing platforms to support the treatment of information. More specifically, given his writings on the oral tradition, where he describes ancient efforts to integrate content and formalisms to revise and reformulate knowledge, I think, and let me be clear, this is speculation, I think Innis would have supported the creation of a platform that converges all or most of the following applications. Google Earth, or an open source variant. Google Earth is like a globe, albeit with an important difference. It permits users to view content, be it natural topography or human activity, at multiple levels of spatial organization. In one viewing, a user can view an entire map of Canada and then zoom down to one section of a city, such as St. Catharines, Ontario. Content can be viewed in multiple formats: cartographic, photographic, and 3D. Geographic information systems. As I intimated above, GIS presents a suite of tools to support pattern detection and data. It is a spatial database, one that combines attribute data, such as ethnicity, with spatial data, such as an address. Agent-based simulations. These simulations are designed to simulate the emergence and persistence of complex systems, including social systems. They enable the programmer to specify an agent or multiple classes of agents, everything from microbes to multinational corporations. Once the agents are specified, the programmer then encodes their behaviors, their rules of interaction with each other and with their surrounding environment. Once that task is completed, the simulator starts a simulation run and sees what emerges. Agent-based modeling is attracting interest in the social sciences and the humanities because they are producing patterns that match, or closely match, patterns extant in current and historic data. They are emerging as an important complement to GIS. Gaming engines. This application supports the creation and dissemination of high-end photorealistic 3D and 4D content. Its purpose generally is to mimic as closely as possible the appearance of the environment it purports to represent, such as a city block. This requirement includes making provision for environmental features such as lighting and physical laws such as gravity. These environments also permit the annotation of their constituents with such content as text files, 2D graphics, and animations and audio files. Increasingly, virtual worlds are becoming malleable and extensible, meaning that it is becoming possible to change the shape and surface appearance of constituents in real time without a re-rendering, a reloading of the site's 3D content. It is also becoming possible to import a model from a different virtual world into your own. High-performance computing. When we speak of modeling, social, economic, or military systems, we are considering scenarios in which there are potentially thousands, hundreds of thousands, or even millions of agents. A simulation of a smallpox pandemic in Portland conducted at the Los Alamos National Laboratory, for example, included 1 million virtual inhabitants. While simulations of this nature are too large to process on desktop computers, they can be run on high-performance computing clusters. High-performance computing facilities, such as those located at the National Center for Supercomputing Applications in the US and the Compute Canada network here, provide the requisite computational power by networking hundreds, in some cases thousands, of processors. The processors work in parallel and provide sufficient power to simulate complex systems such as galaxies and cells. HPC is a paradigm of computing that by the end of this decade will bring exascale levels of computing and currently provides tera and petascale levels of computing. Terascale refers to computing clusters that can process 1 trillion calculations on 1 trillion bytes of data per second. Exascale computing by extension will support 1 quintillion calculations on 1 quintillion bytes of data per second. That's an awful lot of information to process, but Harold Innis was a person who believed in creating applications capable of managing and treating information explosions, and I think he would have approved. And with that, I'll thank you for your kind attention.
Theories, and in what ways did he influence McLuhan?
Could you ask the question again? The mic kicked in just halfway through.
What was Innis's thinking on communication theory, and in what ways did he influence McLuhan?
Good question. Well, have you got an hour? Innis is known primarily for his correlation of the physical properties of material media with individual and cultural biases towards either the dimension of space or time. So the way Innis understood history, multiple domains of human activity, whether it's theology, science, or so forth, were alternately influenced fundamentally by the dimension of space or the dimension of time. And he suggested there was a correlation between, say, the physical properties of media used to communicate, such as paper, which he argued encouraged an outlook towards space, and other material media, such as tablets and so forth, would encourage, by contrast, an interest in the dimension of time. Now, as with anything, and particularly with people like me, I'm going to say it's more complicated than that. Innis has been charged in the past with being a technological determinist. He was not. He threw in a healthy dose of the writings of Immanuel Kant into the way he understood history and human interaction with media. But if you really want to know that, I'm afraid you're going to have to read my book. As far as his interaction or influence on McLuhan, to be honest, I really can't give you a decent answer on that. I can tell you they communicated in the final years of Innis's life. I can say that McLuhan thought enough of Innis's work that he gave the ultimate scholarly compliment that you gave at that time, which was he declared his own work to be a mere footnote to the work of Harold Innis. So, pretty high praise, but to the, whether they came on their ideas independently or whether Innis had an influence on McLuhan, I haven't done enough research to say.
Hi, my question is in relation to your complex systems and social structures. I noticed on your slide you were talking about increasing returns, and my question is, the more that we socialize and organize and self-organize, does it take more and more energy to do this? And at what point does that become a diminishing return? And at what point does that mean the end of growth if we're going back to the whole economic part of complex systems?
Okay. This is where I have to fake an answer and pretend I know what I'm talking about. The honest answer is I have no idea. I really have no idea. I mean, I expect you've been exposed to how increasing returns occur when they stop. I mean, there's a point of equilibrium in which they stop. Once the system is in a point of equilibrium, that's when diminishing returns govern the behavior of the constituent actors of that particular system. The desirability of one dynamic or the other, well, I'll leave that for you to adjudicate. For my part, I think that's a dynamic of economic change that really is unavoidable. I think Harold Innis would have said the same. I think the issue is not whether that dynamic can be avoided, but how it can best be managed.
Any other questions?
Hi, I just have a question about, I guess the question is about how you, as a historian, see or think about some of the ideas you're talking about here that involve extracting patterns from very complex sets of information. So a couple of times you mentioned when you're talking about Innis, things like, formalisms and pattern replication and getting a lot of data about very complex things and putting it all together. And I was just struck by that because a lot of the historians I know are kind of skeptical, as historians, I mean, of attempts to get simple morals from history or to say, oh, this happened, we can learn from this case that this is going to happen now. So I wasn't sure, like, just as a historian, if you had an opinion about that kind of epistemological strategy.
Okay. I think the activity that I'm describing, which is to better understand how a particular system emerged, and the use of computation to help us with that, that's a fundamentally different task than the issue of coming to some sense about its significance. Okay, so the idea of drawing lessons from history or morals from history, that's not necessarily something that's implicated in the type of methods that I'm describing here. These methods can be of use in making such adjudications. In other areas, I have talked about how they can be used to make such adjudications, one being the use of counterfactuals. Agent-based models are very good for supporting the generation of counterfactuals. Now, why would you do that? One reason is that in history, one way you determine the significance of an event is by having a look at what could have happened but did not through a counterfactual reasoning. And agent-based modeling provides one way to create rigorous counterfactuals about the past. So one example of how you might do that in concrete terms is one of my hats many years ago used to be, I did work on the decision to use the atomic bomb. It's a very controversial decision, and there are many things relating to that decision that historians fight about, one of which has to do with how many casualties likely would have died if the Allies had been required to actually invade the island of Kyushu in November of 1945 and the island of Honshu in March of 1946. Now, up until the 1980s, what happened was that historians and pretty well anybody else relied on the post-war apologies of policymakers like Secretary of War Henry Stimson, Harry Truman, and so on. And they gave numbers that ranged between 500,000 and 2 million. Now, Barton Bernstein, who was a historian at Stanford, came along in the mid-1980s and was able to produce contemporary documents that suggested that the highest threshold of not only deaths, but deaths and casualties would have been around 110,000, 120,000 at most. That's pretty significant because if you realize the number of people who died at Hiroshima and Nagasaki combined, if memory serves, was around 140,000. So if what Bernstein said was true, then invading would have been the better option, and it puts a different coloration on the use of the atomic bombs. Now, as matters turned out, there were other scholars who were able to locate documents that showed policymakers actually were exposed to figures of 500,000 or 200,000 and actually acted on them. So on one level, that's important because at least we weren't being sold a bill of goods after the war. On the other level, it's not particularly significant because the method that Army planners used to generate casualty estimates by our standards today were pretty crude. What they did was basically a case of analogical reasoning, where what you would do is you would find a battle in the past in which the environment was similar to the characteristics that you were about to face in your forthcoming battle. What you would do is retrieve two ratios, the ratio of deaths to force expended and the ratio of casualties to force expended. You would then take those two ratios, apply them to the total force expended in the future battle, come up with your casualty estimates. What I suggest is through methods like high-performance computing and agent-based modeling, we can do better. We would be able to combine, we'd be able to create armies numbering that would be as large as the actual armies were on the ground. The Japanese, for example, were planning to deploy 1.1 million troops. The Allies, that's an open question, but it would likely have been larger. You could create simulations mimicking the activities of troops, the weaponry, and so forth, turn on the simulations, do multiple runs, come up with a statistically probable estimate of how many people would have died if that battle had taken place. So that can play a role then in the moral conclusions that you reach from history, but the use of the computational method doesn't necessarily presuppose moral reasoning at the end of the process.
Thank you. We don't have any time for any more questions. I think last round of applause for